So let's talk about what happens when you're at these boundaries between adjoining regions, whether that's the northeast to the southeast, or it's between one of the Great Plains regions and the northeast or the southeast. We want you to look at that region and look at where the site is and determine which SDAM to apply based on where the site is. So it's not based on the contributing catchment. It's not, well, most of the watershed comes from this region. It is based on the actual location of the site. And so we recommend that you only run the SDAM for that region. If the site, when looking at the Wool et al. 2016 paper, and the site is very close to the border, you may want to run the SDAM for both regions for that site just to compare the result. And while we'd recommend primarily relying on the region that's description from the Wool et al. Paper most matches your site, and the region where it falls geographically within, it may be useful information because this paper, like all of our large regional boundaries, they're not super refined at the detailed edge, and so it may be that your particular site falls more within the description of the adjoining region. So you'll see in the SDAMs that we produce, and at the end of this presentation, when we start talking about the web application of how you calculate stream flow duration, you do have the opportunity to run a different region and produce a report and an outcome for it. So that's possible. Your report will show that, warning, this is not based on the location. But what we want you to do when you're at that boundary is look for what region it falls within and go with that primarily. So let's talk about our method development. We developed these SDAMs following along with what we laid out in a paper published in 2020, Fritz et al. And we followed that method now in developing several SDAMs across the country. And that starts with identifying the candidate indicators through an extensive literature review of existing SDAMs, as well as literature about individual indicators and information that might be pertinent and studies that might be pertinent to support the testing of a potential indicator. So we have our literature review for the Northeast, Southeast regions we finalized last year, and in that, we identified 15 geomorphological indicators, for example, slope, bank full width, sinuosity, substrate. We also identified 8 hydrological indicators, both falling in the direct hydrological, presence of surface flow, presence of base flow, as well as the indirect indicators that show that water was present and at what elevation, like drift lines. And debris piles. We also have a number of biological indicators we collected in the field, fish presence, macroinvertebrate presence, different classifications of macroinvertebrates presence and subcategories. In addition to these field indicators, we also identify a number of geospatial indicators that fall into climate, rainfall patterns, temperature patterns, indicators, as well as for the Northeast, Southeast. For the first time, we went back and calculated drainage area for each location on the map for each sampling place. With all of these indicators, we have to then apply them to study reaches. And so we went out and identified reaches across the Northeast and Southeast through literature reviews, through reviews of the USGS gauging networks, other hydrologic databases and studies where folks have measured directly the hydrology for these sites so that we could then interpret their data to be able to reach that true classification for sites of perennial, intermittent, or ephemeral based on direct hydrologic observations. So what we've done is selected all of those sites. And what we came up with and ended up being able to access and sample was 388 study reaches across the Northeast and Southeast. In the end, what has been used to develop the methods for the Northeast and Southeast are a subset of those. 336 sites are actually used in method development. That's because we had a number of sites where we didn't have a complete enough hydrologic record from our own logger data or other sources in which we could confidently classify a site as perennial, intermittent, or ephemeral. And so that if we couldn't confidently classify it, it was dropped and not able to be used in method development. In addition, we did not end up feeling confident that the Caribbean sites, our sites in Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands, of which there were 33, that we were confident that they would be enough like the Southeast to include in development of a Southeast beta method. So we excluded those as well, and that's how we get down to 336 reaches used in method development. Of those, you can see there's a good mix between ephemeral, intermittent, and perennial. And right there in those numbers of 71 ephemeral, 150 intermittent, and 115 perennial, it's relatively easy to find perennial sites and to have USGS gauges on perennial sites. It's relatively rare to have USGS or other studies with direct hydrological observations of intermittent sites, and extremely rare for ephemeral. So we often are finding and having to rely completely on our own logger data for the ephemeral sites and many of the intermittent sites. And that leads us to, unfortunately, often ending up with many sites we expected or predicted to be ephemeral when we get the logger data back actually showing that they're intermittent. And so our intermittent numbers get higher and our ephemeral numbers get smaller. But for each of these, we have directly classified based on the hydrologic data, perennial, intermittent, or ephemeral, as Rachel had shown in the prior slides. Once we have all of this data, both our field data, our geospatial data, and our direct hydrologic classifications, we then use machine learning and statistical models to predict the flow class using random forest from the indicators. And then we continually refine and keep going back and refining until we can get down to the most accurate, defensible, and field implementable method we can. And so that's what we've worked through repeatedly. And when doing that, we found that having separate methods for the Northeast and Southeast, although many of the indicators overlap, was the best path forward. So why a beta method? If we've done all this work, we've collected all this data, why a beta? Because we were working quickly to develop methods and get first run methods out there. And we have learned over many, many years of operating in the regulatory, the confluence of regulation and science, that putting methods out there as final from the beginning is not the best way to gain acceptance and to test run and to work out all the kinks and methods. So we've put in a lot of effort to develop this beta method, but it's going to follow the plan we have for developing all the SDAMs across the country, which is putting out a beta method based on a complete enough data set to have confidence in the method, and put it out there for public review and use for an implementation period to garner feedback, both on the method, publishing the data with it, publishing the data analysis with it, so folks can use it and understand how it was developed and see the data it was developed from, giving us feedback on that, and also giving us feedback on what was clear about the method, the training, what else would be needed for full implementation of a final method, and what areas of their region or specific sites they may have had trouble with for specific indicators or overall for the method. We also were continuing and have been continuing to collect data. So we'd be able to extend repeat visits at some of our sites, getting us up to 5 visits per site per our instrumented sites. And so those last visits just were completed at the end of last month. The last final sites were visited. And so we have all of that additional data to process and hopefully be able to bring in some of those sites that we were not able to classify with our first 3 rounds of visits, bring some of those back in for data analysis for development of the final methods. So we'll have additional site data for those, for hopefully some more hopefully be able to bring in more sites for the Northeast and Southeast. After the implementation period, we will be going back to reevaluate our data in the light of the comments we receive and the feedback from all of our training and from all of you, and from the public, to reanalyze the data with and including the additional data from our instrumented sites to develop final methods. So that's how we develop them. Now let's talk about what they actually are. The SDAM for the Northeast and the SDAM for the Southeast share many of their indicators. So they share 5 indicators, which are present in both methods, and then they each have a few indicators just for one. And they span biological indicators, geomorphological, and geospatial. As we go through this, we will go into each of these indicators and how to collect them, and what to look for in detail throughout this training. But as we go through it, just a quick look here is showing the bold ones are showing what was also included in the Great Plains Beta SDAM. So you'll see many of these indicators are also used in the adjoining regions of the Great Plains, percent shading, absence of rooted upland plants in the stream bed, bankful channel width, and particle size of stream substrate. And what you'll see is often adjoining regions for SDAMs have similar methods. So they share some indicators, but not all of their indicators. And that's why we've been developing these methods on a regional basis, because we know streams vary, climate, hydrology, and other drivers. The underlying geology varies, biological communities even vary. And so we develop these on a regional basis so it can be as accurate as possible, but we continue to see some of those larger trends, especially the value of biological indicators showing up in all of the SDAMs across the country. So our classifications are based on outputs from a statistical model. You will be required to enter the information collected from the field, as well as the one desktop indicator of calculating drainage area from stream stats, where available, or using the National Map Viewer where not. You will be required to enter those into the web application. So the statistical model is, at this time, beyond our ability to put into Excel and run for you, so you will have to enter it into the web application. And then it will automatically spit back the answer. It'll also automatically place you in the right region and apply the right climate factors. In this case, there's a period of 3 months. So how else do they compare? This is getting to be a pretty busy table as we've produced more and more SDAMs across the country. But in general, you'll see biological indicators show up as one of the types of indicators used in all of the SDAMs across the country, from the Northeast and Southeast beta method all the way over to the final method in the Pacific Northwest. Some SDAMs use single indicators. Single indicators were not found to give additional value or accuracy in the Northeast, Southeast, and so they were not selected for inclusion for the beta methods Northeast and Southeast. It is, like the other models, developed as a random forest model, and unfortunately it's more complex than able to be simplified into a table or decision tree, and so hence we have to use the web application. It is stratified by region, Northeast and Southeast, and the classifications returned are perennial, intermittent, ephemeral. and at least intermittent. The aquatic invertebrate identification requires some level of aquatic invertebrate identification to be able to reach the richness score, which you'll hear about more as we go through, but not more identification than required in the Great Plains, Western Mountains, or other parts of the country. It does require some hydrophytic plant identification knowledge, mostly to identify whether it is back up, upland, or not rated or a non-indicator species. So basically identifying whether it's not a hydrophyte. And reminder for us, you'll get this again later in the presentation though, is we are identifying upland plants, and for upland in this application for streams, back is counted as upland. And in general, like all of the other rapid SDAMs developed, the overall assessment time should be less than 2 hours in the field, and in reality will be most likely much less than 2 hours once folks get comfortable running the assessment in the field.